Do you want to make a ridiculous amount of money and grow your career? Then San Francisco might be for you. Now, if you want a bit more balance but still grow your career, then I prefer Amsterdam. Time Out magazine named San Francisco as the #1 best city in the world in 2021, with Amsterdam coming in at second place. Hey everyone, this is David. Welcome back to my channel, and I've been living and working in Amsterdam for the past 2 years now, and I'm originally from San Francisco. I've lived and worked in San Francisco and LA. I thought I'd make a video to compare the differences between living and working in a place like San Francisco and living and working in a place like Amsterdam. Let's go. Have you ever felt poor making six figures? Well, welcome to San Francisco. San Francisco and Amsterdam are two of the most expensive cities in the world. And according to Mercer, San Francisco is the 25th most expensive city in the world. Amsterdam is number 44. Now let's quickly take a look at the prices. In San Francisco, if you want to rent a 1-bedroom city center, expect to pay $3,000 per month. In Amsterdam, a 1-bedroom city center is going to cost you around $1,750 a month. Utilities, food, everything else, more or less the same, but it's really rent that's extremely expensive. And if you want to buy, well, good luck. In San Francisco, you'll need to shell out over $1 million. In fact, around $1.5 million for a home in San Francisco. It's cheaper in Amsterdam, but in Amsterdam terms, it's still quite expensive. Expect to pay around 460,000 euros. So here's the thing about San Francisco. You could be making $82,000 per year as a single person, and that puts you at low income. For a family of 4, if you're making $117,000 a year or less, that puts you at low income. San Francisco has turned into a place where if you're making 6 figures, you can still feel extremely poor. But when it comes to cost of living, San Francisco takes the cake as being more unaffordable, because in a place like Amsterdam, the Netherlands, I've heard stories of people working in a restaurant and still being able to get by. If you work as a teacher, if you work at McDonald's in a place like San Francisco, well, good luck to you. If you want to make a lot of money but still feel poor, well, San Francisco might just be for you. I remember there was this Twitter engineer that went viral because he was complaining about struggling to get by because he was only making $160,000. But the fact is, if you work in technology, San Francisco is the mecca. It's the place to be. You're surrounded by top talent, top global tech companies like the FANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. And you're surrounded by this entrepreneurial spirit, a lot of venture capital. This is the place to be if you're in technology. And if you want to make money, you're going to make a lot more money in a place like San Francisco as compared to the Netherlands, especially if you work in technology. For example, if you are a software engineer, you can make over $200,000 per year, including base salary, stock options, as compared to $100K in a place like Amsterdam. And this is the thing about a place like San Francisco. It's America. There's a big gap between the middle class and the rich and the poor as well. In a place like Amsterdam, you don't need to be in tech in order to get by, but in San Francisco, if you don't work in tech, if you work in a normal job, if you work in retail, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to get by. But if you compare a place like Amsterdam to San Francisco, it depends. If you work in tech, San Francisco is the best place to be. If you don't work in tech, I think Amsterdam is a lot easier to get by and to survive. So there's this saying that Americans live to work and Europeans work to live. And in many ways that is true. Having lived and worked now in both San Francisco and Amsterdam, I'm now able to compare and contrast the differences in work cultures. And even when I ask HR colleagues, what's the biggest difference between employees in San Francisco and employees in the Amsterdam offices? And the biggest difference is that people in San Francisco work a lot more. And I see this for myself as well. When the clock hits 5 p.m., 5:30 in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, most people are out the door. But in a place like San Francisco, when it hits 5 p.m., most people are still working. And so there's a big difference in work culture mentality. And when it comes to vacation time, there's a big difference as well. The US does not guarantee its citizens minimum vacation time, whereas in Europe, in the Netherlands, we get a guaranteed minimum of 20 days per year. And it doesn't stop there. Even if we get vacation time in the US, Americans don't take 100% of their vacation time. Actually, in the US is the country that leaves the most unused holidays
unused vacations at the end of the year. Let me explain. I currently have 5 weeks of vacation working in the Netherlands, and I usually take up the full 5 weeks because everyone around me is taking the full 5 weeks. It's part of the work culture. I also had 5 weeks working in the US as well, but I never took the full 5 weeks because I thought, what would people think about me if I took 5 weeks? Even taking a 2-3 week holiday, I had to question myself, okay, is that possible? How much work would I have to do? And what would my manager think? So that's a big difference between the mentalities of Americans and the mentalities of the Dutch and Europeans. Americans live to work and Europeans seem to work to live. Dutch kids are the happiest kids in the world, according to UNICEF. And I think a big reason for that is because of how they're raised, socialized, and educated in the Netherlands. They're taught to become independent thinkers. I remember reading this story in the New York Times about droppings, where parents in the Netherlands would drop off their kids in the middle of the forest so that they can learn to think for themselves to get back into society. And I remember starting my master's program. I was 30 years old at that time, and I was in this program with 21, 22-year-olds, and I was thinking, what can I learn from these 21-year-olds? But I was really surprised because of how smart and sharp they were, especially in discussion. So Dutch kids are raised to become very sharp, critical thinkers in the education system. Now, I also remember in the first week of our master's program, we did presentations about our education systems in our countries. When I talked about the US, I talked about how stressed out I was studying for the SATs, keeping up my grades, extracurriculars to try to get into a good college. Now, when the Dutch kids came and presented, they told us that they didn't really understand what stress was up until, I think, university. And they didn't really get homework until, I believe, high school. So that's the biggest difference. In the US, it's very competitive trying to get into a good college. In the Netherlands, it's still stressful, but less stressful because there's less competition. And student debt can cause a lot of pain, stress, anxiety. And student debt, it's a big part of American culture because if you want to pay for college, you have to pay $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 per year in tuition. Now compare that with Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and you only have to pay around 2,000 euros per year if you're an EU citizen. And that was a big deciding factor for me when I was thinking about studying in the Netherlands or the US for my graduate program. In the Netherlands, I had to pay $16,000 per year in tuition for 1 year. Now, the same program in the US, 2 years, $80,000 in tuition. So for me, it was an obvious choice. I didn't want to be in student debt again. Now, there's a lot of things I can say about education, but the fact is it's a lot cheaper to study in the Netherlands for the same quality education, less stressed out, less debt, and also less competition as well because most universities in the Netherlands are high quality compared to the US where there's just a lot more competition for getting into a good school. If you think education is expensive in the US, then I hope you don't get sick without health insurance in the US. That can be expensive. Well, the fact is 50% of Americans hold medical debt, and healthcare, it's also a business like education is. Imagine paying $600 for a Band-Aid in the US. Yes, $629 for a Band-Aid in the US. Well, the system in the US, it's known to be expensive, it's known to be complicated, and it depends on your healthcare insurance plan, which can be a mess. Now, in my experience, it depends on the company that you work for. You could be working for a great company with a great healthcare plan, and you might not have to pay anything for healthcare. Now, most people aren't as fortunate, and they have to pay a lot of money for healthcare. Well, if you look at the deductibles, how much you have to pay before healthcare kicks in the US, the average, it's around $4,000 per year. Now, the deductible in the Netherlands is 385 euros per year, so a lot less. And healthcare, it's regulated by the government in the Netherlands, and 99% of people have health insurance in the Netherlands because it's required. It's also affordable. People pay around 100 euros per year for health insurance. Healthcare in the US, it's quite quite complicated. It's a mix of public and private health insurance, whereas in the Netherlands, it's regulated by the government and people pay a set amount every year. And if you go to a dentist or any GP, the prices are pretty much the same because it's standardized, whereas in the US, well, good luck trying to compare costs because it could differ based on where you are, which state you're in, which health insurance you have, and it's a complicated mess in the US. One thing I do have to note about going to the doctors in the Netherlands is that it can be very complicated and stressful because if you have something minor that's not something big like an emergency, then you won't get treated because the culture in the Netherlands is if you have something minor, then you don't go to the doctors. That's unlike the US where you go for annual checkups. And so if you want to see a doctor in the Netherlands, you have to pretend or complain that you're almost dying because you won't get treated. I'll use myself as an example. I was taking a stroll in the park and I got bit by a pit bull, and so I needed to go to the doctors, the hospital to get a tetanus shot. And so I went to the hospital a few blocks away, and the nurse told me that my bite was actually not big enough. It was not an emergency, and so I had to go to my general practitioner to get a tetanus shot. And I was extremely stressed out because at that time I was still shocked from the bite. I didn't know what to do, and so that's kind of the reality of it. If you have something small, minor, not life-threatening, then you won't get treated and you might have to wait. But all in all, healthcare in the US, it's a complicated mess, and in the Netherlands, it's cheaper, it's affordable, and it's just a lot easier. So there's no shortage of things to do in a place like San Francisco and Amsterdam being the #1 and #2 best cities in the world. I would say that the big difference is that there's a bit more variety in a place like San Francisco just due to its climate, the weather. For example, there are beaches nearby in San Francisco. You can take a stroll on the beach. You can go surfing. You can do a hike in Land's End. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge. There's concerts, there's nightlife, there's museums. You can go visit Golden Gate Park, Dolores Park. There's weekend activities for you to do, to visit the Redwoods and Muir Woods, to go for a hike in Mount Tam, to visit Yosemite, to wine taste in Napa, skiing and snowboarding in Lake Tahoe. Now, in Amsterdam, there's also a lot of things to do. It's very international, very diverse, lots of meetups, concerts, festivals. If you happen to be a festival person, Amsterdam and the Netherlands, great place, probably the best place to be. I think there's over 300 festivals in any given year in a place like Amsterdam. There's also the red light district, coffee shops, if you're into that, and of course the canals. I think one of the most interesting things to do is just taking a stroll or a boat ride through the canals of Amsterdam. But all in all, both cities are very international, lots of good nightlife, concerts, museums, things to do in the daytime. But in a place like Amsterdam, when it comes wintertime, it's cold, it rains a lot, it's windy. Most people just like to stay indoors. So I'd say both cities, great, lots of things to do, but there's just a bit more variety in a place like San Francisco. So traveling is probably one of the biggest reasons why I decided to come to Europe, because if you drive 3 hours from Amsterdam, you get to Brussels, Belgium. If you drive 3 hours from San Francisco, you get to Fresno, California. And that's the biggest difference, right? California is a big state. It's bigger than the country of the Netherlands. And if you drive a few hours from San Francisco, you're still in the same state, same language, same culture, more than likely same everything. But a few hours from Amsterdam, you're in a different country, a different language, different architecture, different culture, everything is different. And being in Amsterdam, Schiphol is one of the most popular airports in the world. You can get anywhere within a few hours. And flights can be dirt cheap as well. I flew from Amsterdam to Sevilla, Spain for 50, 60 euros. And I flew from Eindhoven to Slovakia for 11 euros. If you fly budget airlines such as Ryanair or EasyJet, you can find some really cheap deals. So if you want to travel, Europe is the place to be. So when it comes to weather, nobody moves to Amsterdam for the weather, but people move specifically to California, to San Francisco for the weather. For example, when it comes to sunshine, San Francisco gets around 260 days of sunshine per year, and in Amsterdam, it's only around 177 per year. And when it comes to the temperature, Amsterdam is colder than San Francisco. San Francisco, the temperature is quite mild year-round, and it ranges between 45 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 77 to 24 degrees Celsius. Now in Amsterdam, the ranges can be from 38 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, or 3 to 18 degrees Celsius. When it comes to seasons in San Francisco and California, there aren't too many seasons, but you do have seasons in Amsterdam, which is something that I do enjoy when it comes to fall, autumn, springtime. But the winters are terrible in Amsterdam because it's cold, it rains a lot, it's windy, and the days are very short. For example, in December or January, sunrise is around 9 a.m. and the sun sets around 4:30. So you only get around 7 to 8 hours of sunshine per day if you get the sun, because most days it's cloudy, it's rainy, and it's quite depressing. But one thing I do love about having seasons coming from California, where you don't really have many seasons, is that when spring comes along and you see a ray of sunlight, you feel extremely happy. You can sense and you can feel the change of seasons. I also love fall and autumn, the colors of the leaves, and it's just a very unique experience that we don't get coming from California. But when it comes to weather, climate, San Francisco, California takes the cake. And when it comes to food, nobody also moves to Amsterdam for the food. When I think about Dutch food, I think about bread, cheese, bitterballen, which is great. Bitterballen is Dutch meatballs. But the Dutch, they're well known for many things, but food is not one of them. I remember my first time experiencing Dutch food. When I arrived on my first day in Maastricht, I had my orientation for my university, and there was free lunch. I was really hungry, and there was a line of lunch bags at the cafeteria. I grabbed mine, I went to the table, I opened it up, and something was missing, something between the sandwich. So I went back to the table and I talked to the lady, and I basically asked her, can I get a new sandwich because there's something missing in mine? And she responded and said, that's your sandwich. And so it was literally a slice of cheese and 2 slices of bread, but that's Dutch food for you. And that's very typical when it comes to Dutch lunch. Cheese sandwiches. I've heard of stories of people dining, especially in a Dutch company for lunch, where people congregate around a table and there's cheese, there's bread, sometimes there's meat, and that's a Dutch lunch for you. So the Dutch, well known for many things, but not Dutch food. But to be fair, in a place like Amsterdam, it's very international. So there's a lot of international cuisine. There's great Turkish food, there's great Indonesian food as well, and you can find any type of restaurant. But when it comes to variety of food and range of options, San Francisco is a better place to be, because in a place like San Francisco, you have great Asian food, Mexican food, crab, seafood, sourdough bread, many different types of options, Michelin restaurants. I'm drooling already. And so when it comes to food, a place like Amsterdam, it's great if you want to eat out. There's a lot of international restaurants, but in terms of diversity, range of options, San Francisco is a better place to be for foodies. Did you know that there are more bicycles than people in the Netherlands? Well, that's a fact. The country, it's built for cyclists, and if you enjoy cycling, Amsterdam is a great place to be. It's the main mode of transportation. But if you don't want to cycle, especially in the wintertime, then you can take the train or the tram or the buses that connect the city. For example, if you take the train from Amsterdam to Utrecht, it only takes around 30 minutes. And if you want to get to the southernmost part of the country, Maastricht, it takes about 3 hours to get there. Now, in a place like San Francisco, yes, you can cycle, but it's a bit dangerous, especially in the city center, because you're competing against cars, buses, other trams, and other cyclists, and it can be a bit dangerous. But there are buses and there's a metro, Muni Metro, to connect the city, and there's BART that connects San Francisco to other parts of the Bay Area. And nowadays, ride sharing has become quite popular. For example, Ubers and Lyfts to get around the city. Now, when it comes to having a car, I would say it's easier to have a car in a place like San Francisco. And if you have a car in a place like Amsterdam, that can actually be a pain in the ass because of parking. You don't need a car to survive in the Netherlands, but it helps to have a car in a place like San Francisco. So all in all, when it comes to getting around public transportation, I would say it's a lot easier, more effective, and more efficient in a place like Amsterdam. I've never felt unsafe in Amsterdam. And yes, I'm a guy, but even talking to women, they've also told me that they've never really felt unsafe in the city. Now, the same can't be said about San Francisco because you just have a lot more crime and a lot more crazy people in San Francisco. You have more car thefts, burglaries, violence. And the thing about San Francisco is there's a big homeless population that nobody really knows about until they visit. For example, people have told me the culture shocks that they've encountered when they go into Market Street, downtown San Francisco, and they see this big contrast between people and the techies coming out of the tech buildings with their backpacks and sweaters. And right on the side, there are tents, homeless people walking around. So it's a very big contrast between those who have something and those who don't. You don't see this in a place like Amsterdam, and I think the biggest type of theft you have to worry about, or crime, is bike theft. Yes, you probably will have your bike stolen in a place like Amsterdam, but I'll take bike theft any day over the craziness of San Francisco. Now, when it comes to diversity, both cities are extremely diverse, extremely international. When you think about an open, progressive city in the US, San Francisco comes to mind. In Europe, Amsterdam comes to mind. When it comes to ethnic diversity, I think in Amsterdam there's over 180 nationalities, and in San Francisco, about 33% of the population is foreign-born. So many different types of people from around the world. In the US, you'll find a mix of whites, blacks, a lot of Asians, a lot of Hispanics. And in a place like Amsterdam, you have, of course, Dutch, other Europeans, Moroccans, Turkish, Surinamese, Indonesians. And so very ethnically diverse cities, both Amsterdam and San Francisco. One thing to note is that it seems like in a place like Amsterdam and San Francisco, most of the population seem to be expats nowadays, especially like a city like San Francisco, where people from around the world come to San Francisco to work in tech. Similarly, in Amsterdam, many people move to Amsterdam to work and to find a job. And I think for me, when I come back to San Francisco nowadays, comparing it now to 10, 15, 20 years ago, it's still very diverse, meaning I meet people from around the world, but everyone seems to come from tech. And in that sense, it's not very diverse when it comes to professions. Whereas in Amsterdam, you'll meet people in tech, you'll meet people in nonprofit, in government, because you can work in these other jobs and still survive. In fact, in a place like Amsterdam, 30-40% of housing is dedicated to social housing. So even if you don't make a lot of money, you can still find a way to survive. Whereas if you're a teacher in San Francisco, well, good luck trying to survive, because many people now live outside the city and they commute in to work in San Francisco. So there you have it, a comparison between San Francisco and Amsterdam. So which is the better city? Well, I don't think there's a better city, but there probably is a better city specifically for you, depending on who you are, the stage of life that you're in. Are you single? Do you have a family? Are you 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, or 70? Now, I think if you enjoy the great outdoors, if you're extremely ambitious, you want to hustle, you work in technology, you enjoy food, you want good weather, then San Francisco is a great place to be. Now, if you want a bit more stability, a bit more balance, you want to travel, you want to experience Europe, then I think Amsterdam is a great place to be. Now, but my overall opinion is that if you're American and you want to experience Europe, or you're a European and you want to experience American culture, or if you're from some different part of the world and you want to experience another part of the world, that's always a really great growth and learning experience. So I hope this was somewhat helpful. This is my opinion. I hope you take care, and let me know if you have any questions or suggestions or ideas or thoughts, opinions in the comments below. Take care, and I'll see you later.